Well, another Monday morning is here, and I'm gonna whip you guys. I had none of these random photo things for a while, so I figured I'd go through some of those because I can usually pull up some experience from those to talk about that might give you a hand here. So see if you can make your way through this one with me. This kind of thing is what you typically see on fan circuits and other high current circuits where the terminals are supposed to have a nice even tension between the terminal that goes in and the terminal that grips it on the outside. And what happens is that as the current flows, the fan circuit heats up these things. This was actually under, a radiator coolant fan that wasn't working right. And you can see that these terminals are kind of oxidized here. See how they see the oxidation there? And what happens as they oxidize, and I've talked about this before, they begin to develop resistance, and as they begin to develop the resistance, they heat up a little more, and everything snowballs. So the more resistance you have, the more heat you have, and eventually it breaks down so that there's very little current at all. You begin to drop voltage there, and when you drop voltage, it's because of resistance, and if it's a high current circuit, you're going to have some heat as a result of that. I had an instructor one time, a Chrysler instructor down in Louisiana, and I went to whenever we bought the Renault Renault AMC franchise at the dealership where I was working back in '88, and I went to several Jeep schools, and it seemed like I was in Jeep school as much as I was at the shop there for a while. But then Daimler Chrysler wound up buying Jeep from AMC, and so I had to go whenever a new franchise comes around. They've got to train you on their electrical course, and so even if you've taken electrical courses and done electrical work your whole career, if you're working at a dealer, they want everybody to be trained on electrical first. And that was before the days of having, taking the stuff on computer before you went down there, the courses on computer, which is what they usually do now. But I went down there, and this guy he knew the Chrysler stuff really well. I don't know that he had ever fixed a single car. I think he was just an instructor. But he was trying to convince the 12 mechanics in that class that resistance does not cause heat. And everybody in there was rolling their eyes when he said that. And so I took him on that, and I said, why in the world are you even saying that? That doesn't even make any sense. If resistance didn't make heat, why do they need to make resistors out of ceramic? In other words, they actually put a resistor in ceramic, like even the old ballast resistors that were hooked up to the coils. Ceramic, it takes a lot of heat, and that's why they do that. If you ever touch one of those, whenever car's been flowing through, it'll burn your hand too. Anyway, he finally conceded that, well, yeah, resistance did make heat, blah, 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 and all that. But one way or another, I've seen a lot of this kind of thing. Anytime you got a circuit that's not working, this is common on blower motor circuits too, will develop this kind of problem either at their blower resistor or where the connector plugs right into the fan. And if the pin that's fuel pump circuits on some of your GM vehicles will do this too. Volkswagen, back when I was at a dealer in early 80s, they had pin A8 on the Rabbits that carried the fuel pump. It was just a little pin the same size as all the other pins, but it couldn't handle that current. And so sometimes if you see a melting like this, it's because the fan is pulling too much current. But sometimes there's nothing wrong with the fan. It's just because you had a little dab of voltage drop, maybe because the connector was disconnected and reconnected too many times or something like that. A GM instructor once said that if you disconnect and reconnect some of the GM connectors 4 times, that you don't have good pin fit anymore. So that's something you need to consider if you're unplugging and plugging those things in a lot. This is another situation where there was some voltage drop and melting. We basically replaced the fuse panel. A salvage yard usually would come up with a fuse panel, and that's what we had to do on this one. Rather than try to fix this mess that we saw here. I don't remember what kind of vehicle it was on. I think it was a GM vehicle, but I could be wrong one way or another. No, this would have been a Ford, because I'm looking at a Ford part number right there on that relay. change that to red. See that Ford part number? So this would have been a Ford. All of these relays have got Ford part number, so that would have been a Ford. That wouldn't have been a GM. One way or another, this nasty voltage drop situation necessitated, it was causing all kinds of electrical issues, and so we decided to go ahead and just replace the whole thing with a salvage yard unit. Usually you can find a salvage yard. Now if it's a totally integrated power module off of a Chrysler or something like that, it gets a little dicier, you know, because it's not a one-size-fits-all proposition. And so usually when you get one of these from the salvage yard, they just cut the connectors. I mean, they cut the wires, you know, and they send you the connectors with it, which is really a good thing because you may need those. This was an out-of-time situation. You know, whenever you put one together, I had seen students who put timing belts on, and they would have me come look at it. And you'd come look at it, and if it looked like this, it's a tooth out. And see, these two here are supposed to be perfectly lined up right across here, and see how this one here is down there and that one there is down there. That needs to be fixed because it's not in time, and you wind up with surging and low power and that kind of thing depending on which way it's out of time. Now there was a Mustang at the Ford dealership that when the mechanic put it back together, he got one of the camshafts 10 degrees advanced because he put it didn't line up on his sprocket the right way. And my buddy Donnie said it was really interesting because that thing ran stronger than normal because the cam timer was advanced a little bit on one bank. But he said what you saw was the fuel trims were 10 degrees plus on one bank and 10 degrees minus on the other bank. And so that was an interesting set of circumstances that came from that. He said, I found myself wondering what would happen if you built that engine with the timing 10 degrees advanced on both banks. If it gives more power and all that. And it probably would, but it would affect emissions. And that's one of the reasons you degree camshafts. Your hot rod guys always did that. And there's cam gears that have got degree marks on them for that purpose, Now this right here, this EGR assembly, this was on a 2003 Crown Victoria, and my pickup's a 2007 model, and it's got one of these units like this. Now what you got in that unit there is you've got basically, this is like a DPFE, but it's also a map sensor, and it corresponds with this. And so of course your EGR valve part of it with a diaphragm that raises the pintle and lets the EGR flow. Actually the EGR flows this way, not the other way. And then you got your DPFE. See, the DPFE, the EGR vacuum regulator is right here. And what they did was, and it was pretty smart, they put all this together in one assembly. And what do they call that mode? That mode that gives you all of the maximums and minimums, mode 6 data, that's what I was trying to remember. The radio that I've got in my Explorer is an Android radio, and it's got this torque app on it, and I've got a little ELM 327 plugged in up under there, and I can actually pull the scan tool data up, including mode 6 data, on my radio, which is pretty darn cool. So I can actually watch the temperature, the catalytic converters and all that. Anytime I want to pull that stuff up going down the road, you can look at all kinds of PIDs. You can build yourself a little dashboard and have all kinds of different gauges on it with either graphs or needles or whatever you want to do, or just, numbers. And you can get gas mileage display on there. I mean, it's really cool to have that. And that was just a $200 radio I bought years ago that I put in there. But and it's got GPS on it too. It's not one of these big fancy new ones. It is a touch screen, and it's just a handy thing to have. So I could pull that mode 6 data up and tell whenever I've got something that's wobbling out of line, and I start looking in that direction. This right here is the old Nemesis scan tool. Now we're obviously looking at transmission stuff here. What you got here, digital transmission range sensor, has got 4 different switches in it, and it's a binary code kind of a thing, and so it's basically telling you where you're at. It gives you your transmission range sensor volts, but it also gives you, see, it's looking at both of those, and it's giving you whether each switch is open or closed. And I used to have my students figure the binary code out on that, you know, and basically it starts from the right side and goes to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, with each switch. You know, actually it's 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's each value will be 0, 1, 0, 1, whatever, and you add the numbers up that are above those to determine what the binary code is. And that's how that computer uses digital sensors to determine something like transmission range and all that. Of course, once again, it's also looking at the voltage a different way. This transmission fluid temperature sensor is an invalid thing that's not on this vehicle. That's why it's reading minus 338. And so this is giving you all this good stuff. Anyway, I like this little scan tool. When I bought 2 or 3 of those for the school, and I bought one for myself. It was like $550 when I bought it. And years later, my buddy that runs a shop over here about 30 miles from here, he told me he needed something that would read OBD1 on the old vehicles. It did not have OBD2, and he didn't have anything that he could find to do that. So I had this tool. I hadn't hardly ever used it, and it would read OBD1 because it was old enough so that the adapters and the software was included with the tool. If you selected an OBD1, then it would do that. And so I basically sold him the tool for $150, and it was nearly brand new, even though I had never used it. I mean, it was several years old, but I had never used it. And this was made by OTC. It was a pretty nice little tool if you get right down to it, and it could graph your readings and all that. Now this right here is courting a blowout. You notice this is on the inside of the tire where you might not notice it if you just looked at the tread and didn't pay close attention. You wouldn't notice that this tread was beginning to separate. And this is very, very dangerous. If you see something like this, you don't need to keep driving the vehicle with a tire like this because it's liable to come apart. And it's not a bad idea to take a good look at all the tires whenever whenever you get a chance. Like you can actually do this yourself if you get down there and look with a, unless you've got it off the ground where you can turn the tire and look at it everywhere, you may miss some of this, because you notice this was only like from here to here. So if you were looking anywhere else around that tire, you might not spot that. But whenever I would see something like this, and we have the car up on the lift, I would tell the people, whoever owned the car, we need to do something about this because there's a big problem coming here. And usually they would listen if you would show them this instead of just telling them you need a tire and letting them, go with that. Now I thought this was pretty cool. On a Chevy and GMC pickup of this vintage in the 2000s, but right after 2000, between 2000 and, about the mid 2010, whatever, you would see these things. This is not normal. You're going to see more trucks that look like this in that vintage than you are that still have this. Now I saw one guy but put a screw into both sides here. Some smart guy, whenever he replaced his bezel, he actually drilled right in here, and he put a couple of screws in there that weren't long enough to interfere with anything behind it. But when he put those screws in there, that thing was going to stay, and it looked really good the way that he did it. Now, a lot of people just give up on this, and they just reach in there and pull the rods and open their tailgate. I mean, I can't count the number of these I've been behind in the drive-through, but that's just one of those things that was crummy on that year model truck, and a lot of people had that issue. Of course, and Ford's had stuff like that too on some of the Explorers, like the 03, 04, 05 Explorers. The panel underneath the rear glass will crack until they finally did away with that and changed the design of the rear door. Thankfully, mine's an 06 and it doesn't have that. But if you get behind one of those Explorers, it's like an 04 or an 05 model, you're going to see that panel cracked under that rear glass. And it's a common problem for those things. I don't know if it's temperature changes that does it or whatever. Now this is an OTC, not the Nemesis, but the Genesis. Now Nemesis, they did make a color screen Nemesis toward the end of the production life of that tool. That was pretty cool. But what you're looking at here is look at the short fuel trim on this, 25 degree. That means it is adding a lot of fuel to try to correct for a lean condition. And so your long-term fuel, this is a short-term fuel. So what happens is, usually you'll see, and this is sort of reversed, because usually you'll see long-term fuel at 25 and short-term fuel at 0. Why? Is because it will begin to correct the long-term fuel. It keeps ratcheting it up until it gets it up to the point of where the short-term fuel goes back to 0. This was taken right after we thought we had fixed it because we had found an air leak. We erased the memory, plugged it back in, fired it up, and it immediately walked the short fuel trim back up to 25. Well, over time, it would start counting this fuel trim up, and when it hit 25, this one would go back to 0 because it was holding it out of balance so that it would keep it, as close as possible to having the same kind of exhaust emissions it was supposed to have when it was new. But anyway, always remember that if you see long-term fuel trim at 25 and short-term fuel trim at 0, and you go looking for a vacuum leak and find it, spraying your carburetor spray or whatever, and watching the numbers change. Once you think you've got that fixed, clear the memory, crank it back up, and if those numbers stay close to 0, you got it fixed. If the short fuel trim begins to go one way or another really fast and long, if you got to erase the memory because all that adaptive learning is stored in there, and that's got to be emptied out of there. There are scan tool functions on some of your higher end scan tools where you can just wipe that out and start over. But most of the time you just take the battery cables off for about 5-10 minutes and put them back on and then fire it up. And when it closes loop, you're going to watch and see what that short fuel trim does, because it's the first indicator that something's not right. And of course it's got to be warm and it's got to be in closed loop. Now I'm going to let you listen to the noise on this next one. Got a little bit of a knocker here. The knocker. We will get this changed out in 7 hours. By the end of the day, that engine over there will be in this car, and we will. It's pretty nasty stuff. Time for a motor. You gonna be able to make it happen?
Make it happen.
You're gonna make it happen. And the reason we had to replace that engine was because the catalytic converter came apart and it started rattling pieces of that brick up into the engine through the EGR system, and it ruined the engine. So if you got an Altima that's knocking like that, you better go ahead and put a really good bolt-on aftermarket catalytic converter on there too. What we did was we took the oxygen sensor out and looked into the converter with a scope where you can cut the catalytic converter apart, and you can see where all of that stuff had come apart, and that's what destroyed that engine. Wasn't the engine's fault, but when you bring pieces of rock from that catalytic converter in there, it's going to wipe that engine out. Now this right here was on the Ford Mercury. Only put this platform out a couple of years. The Ford 500 Mercury Montego platform is, those were really pretty good cars, but this rear knuckle was aluminum. And this guy ran over a curb and busted this knuckle on the back of this thing. And at the time I was having trouble finding one. Of course, they're easier to get now. But I managed to find one that was used up in Pennsylvania somewhere that I bought for like $75. But you can see where this thing was broken right here, and that's the same part right here. See that D-shaped hole right there, where that bearing thing, Anyway, this is the exact part that we had to put in that thing, and it went in there. It wasn't all that hard to change, but it was at the time when we were doing it several years ago. I was having trouble finding one of these, and the parts guy, couldn't come up with one. But I think now, if you look for these, they're fairly easy to get. They got brand new ones on eBay and everywhere else. But this is what that car looked like. It was that peculiar thing. Whenever Ford was making a lot of their cars look like a Volvo. Because Ford owned Volvo. I don't know if they still do or not. I probably ought to research that before I shoot off my mouth. But back then they owned Volvo, and some of the Volvo design made its way into the Ford line. The Ford 500 is pretty much gone now. It was only there for a couple of years, and they discontinued it. Reminds you of a Taurus, but it was a different car. Yeah, that's not good at all. That might make a popping noise, hasn't it? That's not a good plan. If you got a ball joint that's doing something like that, one of the things that's always been troubling to me, and I've seen one particular shop around here that's a franchise shop, will try to convince people without showing them. They'll say, all of your front end parts are worn out and need to be replaced, and you're going to have to pay us $700 or $800 or $1,000 or something like that to repair all your front end parts. My aunt went in there because she always had oil changes or something done there on her Crown Victoria, and it was like a 92 model. It was an old car. So she said, they're telling me I need $700 or $800 worth of front end work. Can you look at this? So she brought it to the college and I raised it up. I didn't find so much as a busted boot. There wasn't any wear on anything. The fact that they tried to take her for a ride like that was kind of irritating. But there was a guy that lived in the same apartment, a woman that lived in the same apartment with my dad years ago, whenever he was in his twilight years before he died. And she was bawling and squalling because she had gone to that same shop and they told her front end was going to fall out from under her truck and she was going to die if she didn't pay them $750 to rebuild the front end. And she didn't say, go out there with them and say, show me what you're talking about because I want to see it. She just took their word for it, and she actually was taken for a ride pretty much like my aunt was, I imagine. Now, I didn't look at her truck, but the numbers they give are always between $700 and $1,000 for rebuilding your front end completely. For people get scared they're going to crash and burn, they'll okay all kinds of repairs a lot of the times, and some of these shops have picked up on that. I'm not saying every shop does that, but there are some shops that do. Now, I always thought a truck like this was a work truck that was a cool looking ride that was still in good shape. This one here is be about a 75 model and GMC, and I really like to see. Now, a lot of these trucks in this vintage in the GM line tended to rust out because they didn't have the paint that wasn't thick enough when they sprayed it on there. They don't all rust out, but if you're in a rust belt, you're less likely to see a truck like this still running than you are in whenever you're down here in the South, like in Texas or Alabama or somewhere where our vehicles don't typically rust out. But one way or another, that was a cool truck. Looked like it's well cared for, well looked after, and it's doing what a truck was made to do. See, he's got him a headache rack back there, and he's got his lumber up over it so he doesn't have it sticking out the back of the truck. That's just really a cool thing all the way around. Now this one right here was a Mazda that was sitting in the parking lot over there behind Chick-fil-A, and this thing looked like it had the daylights beat out of it. I saw another one a couple of days ago. It wasn't a Mazda, it was another vehicle that had the donut spare on the rear and a flat tire on the front. So it was sitting there for obvious reasons, because they had tire flat issues and all that. I was noticing that if you wanted to buy one of these new Maverick trucks that Ford's got for an extra $100 and something, you can get a full-size spare, which if I was going to buy one of those trucks, I'd probably opt for that. Typically, whenever I would be driving a vehicle that had a donut spare that came with it, I would go ahead and buy a full-size wheel and put a tire on it and, do whatever I had to haul that full-size spare with me. And I bought a 2007 Taurus back when gas was $4 and something a gallon, years ago. I went ahead and bought that Taurus, and it had a donut in it, and I went straight to the salvage yard. And it was a used car when I bought it now. I went straight to the salvage yard, and I bought a wheel. He didn't give me a wheel and a tire, he just gave me the wheel. I put a tire on it, and I put it in the trunk, fixed everything so that it would fit right. Sometimes you can build something out of a piece of plywood to do that. And I had to know about a week later, I had a flat on that vehicle, and I had to change that tire, which I was really glad, because if you put the donut tire on one side in the front on a front-wheel drive car, you are really working those differential gears over something awful, just going straight down the road. They're just, like some of these little Asian cars will tell you not to put that donut on the drive wheel into the vehicle because it'll destroy the differential gears. Now, as a Cadillac I changed the tire on for a couple of ladies, I noticed that their donut spare was the same diameter as the original tire. That's the way Cadillac did that, which was pretty sharp. It was thinner, it wasn't as heavy a tire, but it was the same diameter, which is smart. I thought that's the only time I've ever seen that. I'm not saying that's the only vehicle that's ever done it. I saw this the other day, and this is an old Wrangler that was, you can tell the paint's kind of oxidized on the hood and all, and it's just got plain old street tires on it. I don't know what in the world happened there that caused them to. Somebody might have had some, well, it's got the original Jeep wheels. You can actually see that little Jeep wheel cover there. But it's unusual to see a Jeep like this that hasn't been dolled up and, you know, had the fenders removed so it can mud and all that kind of stuff. And besides that, look at this. Look at these tires. Look how unusual this is. White wall tires. You don't see white wall tires anymore. These tires are either really old, or, you know, if I was going to drive this Jeep, I would have flipped those white walls around to the inside because they look silly on the outside. They used to be a fancy thing, but not anymore. And this looks like about an 87 or an 88 model Wrangler. And these Jeeps are, you know, popular vehicles and all that, but I liked these older Jeeps better than I like the newer ones because they've got the engine crammed into the under the hood of these newer ones where you can't even hardly, you got to jump through all kinds of hoops to work on it. Here's an old blast from the past. This is going to be from the, you know, like about 1975 or something like this. This is about when I graduated from high school. And a lot of people don't remember, but how they had this gas lid behind the license plate. And Ford did that on some of their cars, like the Granada, I think it was. Some of those cars had that, and it was very cool. Look at the price. Look at the price of the gas. It was like 41 or 42 cents a gallon when I was pumping gas at the gas station back in the mid 70s. And this is going to be right around the time when I was working at the gas station. It might be 1976 or something like that. This was because in '78 when gas started to get more expensive, when Jimmy Carter deregulated, you know, the price of gas, and it went to $1 a gallon within about 2 months, when it had been bouncing around between 40 and 50 cent, or between 30 and 50 cent for a long time. But anyway, this gal right here is dressed in bell-bottom pants, which are kind of coming back now, and she's got this, you know, kind of a 70s hairdo and look about her and all that. There's a cool picture that somebody posted, and I just snagged it because I thought it was fun to look at. This is what we would do when we couldn't get a power window regulator and somebody's window had fallen into the door and it would look like it was going to be 2 or 3 days before we could get a replacement regulator. We would take a piece of PVC pipe and we would cut a notch on the glass, on the end that was going to be up against the glass, which would be up here at the top area. You know, we'd cut a, you know, with a pipe looking like this, we basically cut a notch in both ends of it so that the glass could sit right in there, and we would prop it in the bottom of the door. You notice we got a tie wrap on it, keep it in place. That keeps the window up so that rain doesn't get in the car while we're waiting for the part to come in. And I had said often, I bet if you opened a power window shop, you could probably keep a lot more business in that shop than you think you could if you're somebody that likes to do power window work, and it's not really that hard. 2 of my grandsons, my youngest boy's grandsons, they've already had to replace power window regulators on their vehicles, and one of them drives a Honda Element and the other one drives a Mazda Tribute. The third guy had to put, you know, the third grandson, he hadn't had to put one in his Equinox yet. But the long and the short of it is, here we are looking at a, you know, temporary fix that works, and the plastic pipe's easy to work with, and you can get it into the door fairly easy, you know, so it just really seemed like a good idea to me to hold the window up. The customers appreciate it. Now this is something you need to think about. If you're whacking on that, you know, how you whack on this right here so that this will jump out of here. You don't go in from the bottom with your hammer. That's just a bad idea. You don't want to go there. You're not going to get it out like that. You're going to whack it from here and this will jump out. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to this force to be going into the rack. One of my students did that. He was hitting this right here trying to break it loose, and all of the force from every time he hit the hammer went straight into the rack and messed up the rack, and we had to replace the rack on that car. So you can hit it this way without it going into the rack, but if you hit it that way, it's going to go right into that rack. And so you want to be whacking toward the knuckle in this direction instead of whacking in that direction. That's just a little quick thing that I put together for one of my presentations. Now this right here we used to do whenever you're hearing a scrub noise. It's always a good idea, you know, to check the run out on the brake. Now if you're checking the run out, note this one here's one with the regular bearings in there, but if you got one with a bearing hub behind this, you know, where these are actually on a hub that comes from the inside there, you're basically going to need to pull the rotor off, you know, pull the caliper cage off, pull the rotor off, and do this same test on the flange of that bearing hub. And we have seen those where the rotors had been machined and then had been replaced, and he still had the same scrub noise. And so we got in there and checked and found out that his bearing hub was warped, and it was had like 15 thousandths of lateral run out, and we'd replaced that and took care of the noise that the tire shop had give up on, you know. Now this one right here was the I told my students, you know, I always says don't ram the probes of the meter down into the connector, because you'll spread those terminals and it won't make any connection with the, you know, the terminal you're plugging onto. And this was one that, you know, where we had an ABS sensor code, and or this might have been a coolant sensor, because I'm looking at a radiator hose here, so that ain't gonna be ABS sensor, or it might have been something else. But anyway, if you've got one of these GM connectors of this style, and one of the important things you need to check if you've got electrical issues or something that doesn't work is pin fit. And you usually look in that with a flashlight, and if you see that the pins are all mangled and spread out, they actually have little kits you can buy that's got various different sizes of the right pins, so you can check by plugging that thing in, you know. And here, some people also use numbered drill bits, and they'll actually get one that's the same size as the pin in the controller or whatever, and they'll use that to plug in there and see if it's got a good snug pin fit, because that's an important element. Notice the pressures. We had a bad scroll compressor. This compressor came off of that car, and you can tell it had just come all apart inside. That's fairly common on scroll compressors. I kind of like those. Now this one right here is one of the more interesting ones that I've mentioned before, but I don't know if I've ever displayed it in this fashion. Watch this. Hold on here. Let me see if I can make this work. That should be playing right now, but for some reason it's not. I don't know why. Anyway, you can still see what was going on. This thing, I don't know why that thing won't play. It should. But this thing was puking all kinds of coolant out. Well, let's see what happens here.
Don't need to.
See how that's doing? You'd swear that was a blown head gasket. That's an 89 Bronco. The guy gave us this vehicle because he thought it had a blown head gasket because it was good. And what the deal was he had this was supposed to be, he had this marked on the distributor cap. 1, 5, 4, 2, 6, 3, 7, 8. That's how he had it wired. That's not the firing order on that one. This was 1, 3, 7, 2, 6, 5, 4, 8. Writing with a mouse is hard. That's the firing order on this vehicle. And look at the scorching on these terminals on the inside. Believe it or not, whenever we put a new distributor cap on there, and we've wired it up right. All of that punching the water out and acting like a blown head gasket went away. And so the only thing that was wrong with this thing is he had used the wrong fire in order to wire it up. And he was so convinced that he had a blown head gasket that he gave that 89 Bronco to the school for a trainer vehicle. Now, I used it for a trainer vehicle for several years, and it always ran really good after I fixed that, firing order. And my adjunct instructor, when they just, after I left the college and retired, when they decided to auction that vehicle off, my adjunct instructor bought it for $1,000, and he's been using it on his farm, and it runs like a brand new Bronco, and he's just really happy with it. But that's the story of the 89 Bronco. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I just thank you for coming by. And hey, let's all be careful out there. And I'll see you next time.